Christopher, thank you for joining us.
Nice to be with you.
To start out, I think, we have to ask the basic question, which is, I get asked that as well. Why do you believe that 9/11 is not what the mainstream media and the 9/11 Commission tells us to believe as a al-Qaeda conspiracy perpetrated by 19 terrorist hijackers on airplanes, 4 airplanes that day?
Well, it's very simple. First, that the crime of 9/11, in which 3,000 people were killed, was never really investigated as a crime. The evidence was destroyed, for example, the steel at Ground Zero, and what evidence that was remaining was not analyzed. So the person who was supposed to prosecute the crimes of 9/11 was Michael Chertoff, Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice. And the FBI was supposed to provide him with the analysis of the evidence to prosecute the crimes. None of that ever happened. Rather, the steel from the World Trade Center was sent to a couple of junkyards in New Jersey, cut into small pieces, mixed with other scrap, and sent to China. And it was sent to China at a time when the price of scrap steel was the lowest it had been in 50 years, which meant that just the cost of shipping it to China was eating up all their profit. So this was a crime in which the evidence was destroyed, and that was done because an analysis of the evidence would have proven early on what we now know, that the buildings were exploded, the buildings were demolished with explosions, and that the perpetrators were not the Arabs on the airplanes, but the buildings themselves were wired for destruction. And 93% of the people who died on 9/11 died in the Twin Towers.
Well, so you said, for example, that there was a profit to be made by selling the scrap. Now, who exactly? Was that the owners of the Trade Center buildings that would make profit on that?
Well, they called it recycling. And at the time it was going on in 2001 and 2002, the New York media pretended not to understand basically the chain of custody of who was in control of the evidence. But the evidence was first and foremost under the control of the Department of Justice and their sub-agency, the FBI. And John Ashcroft was Attorney General. His assistant was Michael Chertoff, an Israeli national, by the way. And so these people failed in their official duties to prosecute the crimes because they failed in investigating the crime. There was no investigation. So when you talk about the 9/11 Commission report, or you talk about these building performance documents, these reports, these do not replace an official police investigation, a forensic investigation, which never happened. So the destruction of the evidence is itself a crime. And for that crime, you could hold John Ashcroft, Michael Chertoff, and of course George Bush and Dick Cheney accountable because they served beneath him, beneath the government.
Mm-hmm. So now we start with that question, obviously, being, okay, if the people that are supposed to be investigating this are not properly investigating it, does that indicate then a level of collusion?
Exactly.
Now, my question then would be, at what point, I mean, you're at this point a journalist, at what point do you start to say things are not unfolding properly to my, to my understanding, to my knowledge, my awareness of how the world should work, that there's something else going on here, that there's perhaps a conspiracy at work? At what point does that come into your head?
I understood that in the first week. I was in New York City on September 11th, early in the morning. I couldn't go to Washington, obviously, so we turned around and went back across Pennsylvania. And as I started writing about it, when I got back to Chicago a couple days later, I could see that the government and the media were avoiding two main things. They were avoiding the evidence of explosions in the World Trade Center, and they were ignoring and omitting any discussion of these 5 dancing Israelis. And then these are the guys, these Israeli agents who were caught basically celebrating the collapse, the burning towers behind them in New Jersey. And then thirdly, about a week later, there came out this report about the instant messaging services of Odigo. It's an Israeli company that was based in Herzliya, Israel, and also near the World Trade Center. And some instant messages went out on this text messaging service, Israeli-owned, that warned of an imminent catastrophe at the World Trade Center, and it was sent out about 2 hours before it actually happened. So like 6:45 local time, 6:30. But the thing is that the vice president of the company in Israel, Alex Diamandis, he told the media that the warnings were exact, precise to the minute, meaning that at 8:45, all hell is going to break loose at the World Trade Center. Don't go there. So those things in the first 2 weeks indicated to me that there was a cover-up, that we were being told a false narrative, we were being given a false narrative, and that those were the main issues that were being omitted from discussion.
Right. But that question about the text message service, I mean, was that proven, or was, because obviously a lot of mainstream media says, oh, that was some, conspiracy rumor, anti-Semitic rumors that were spread about
that was printed in the New York Times, I think, and maybe in the Washington Post once, but then later in Haaretz in Israel. And like I said, the vice president of the company, Alex Diamandis, spoke to Haaretz, I believe it was, and said exactly what I just told you, that the warnings were precise to the minute.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I've had Yuval Aviv, for example, right, who was Mossad. He, formerly Mossad, he told me that he had been with George Bush briefing him, especially at that time period. He was briefing the president on a monthly basis, as he says. And he basically had briefed him a month in advance about precisely this type of attack unfolding. Now, his claim, of course, was that Bush didn't, heard it, really didn't take it seriously, or who knows what happened. I mean, he would say that there was perhaps a shadow government at play. I won't speak for him. But the point being that intelligence services were aware of the plots taking place. Now, where do you think Mossad fits into this scheming of this event?
Well, I use the term Mossad to refer to Israeli intelligence in general. But it's a loose use of the term, because an atrocity like 9/11 was planned. We now know it was planned decades in advance, and the first indications and projections, ideations of this idea came out, for example, in a movie by Arnon Milchan in 1978 called The Medusa Touch, with Richard Burton, in which the climactic scene is a 747 flying into the Pan Am building, and then you find that at every point of the matrix, you find either an Israeli agent themselves or a Sayan, an American Jew who's working for the state of Israel. And what we're talking about is a very extreme bunch of people at the top of Israeli intelligence and Israeli military, like Netanyahu, who basically have a psychopathic version of the worldview. And you have to understand that in Israel, in 1976, I think it was, the Likud coalition came to power. When the Likud coalition came to power, it basically brought the terrorist gangs of the 1940s into the top of the government. And it was a very sad day in Israeli history, because it brought these former terrorists like Begin, Shamir, and of course Ariel Sharon into power. And these are people who only know the use of terrorism. That's their modus operandi. And so, when 2001 began, February, we had Ariel Sharon running Israel and George Bush running this country. It was a constellation made for disaster.
I mean, we've had Paul Craig Roberts on this show, who was former assistant Treasury Secretary under Reagan, and he talks about the neocon faction. And he said, look, I mean, these neocons, who obviously, a lot of whom are actually joint Israeli U.S. citizens, right? This bunch were basically being, they were imprisoned for their crimes during the Iran-Contra era under the first Bush, right? When Bush was running that operation as vice president, and then as president, he was able to pardon a lot of these guys, right? Guys like Poindexter and Abrams. But the point being that this same crew that's running operations in the 80s is now all of a sudden given another carte blanche access to the presidency through Bush Jr. Part 2.
Precisely. And Ariel Sharon was the Israeli defense minister when they invaded Lebanon in 1982. And the atrocity of the massacre in Sabra and Shatila was blamed on him by a commission in Israel, the Kahana Commission. And the Kahana Commission recommended that he lose his portfolio as Minister of Defense, which was taken away. And they also recommended that he never serve in an Israeli government again. But in 2001, he was elected. And, we saw what Ariel Sharon was all about when he went up on the Temple Dome with a bunch of soldiers and basically started an intifada. He started an uprising all by himself. Because this is a man who thrives on terrorism and tension and war. And that's basically that's who's been running Israel since 1976, basically, is these people. And, Menachem Begin, who was the founder of the Likud party, who took Israel into the war in Lebanon, was also the person who bombed the King David Hotel in July 1946. And that's very similar to 9/11 because the reason they bombed the King David Hotel is because it was British headquarters in Mandate, Palestine. And the British had gone out on an operation and collected a lot of evidence and previous to that. And they had information that would have hanged the leaders of the Yishuv, the leaders of the Jewish community in Palestine, the Zionist Committee. And even the Jewish Agency was implicated in the evidence. So they had to destroy the King David Hotel in order to destroy the evidence.
Right.
And they have the same thing on 9/11. You have the destruction, for example, of Building 6, the Customs House, where the vault down below the building, where all the evidence from the Enron crime and the WorldCom and various gold financial scandals and just all kinds of things like that, big crimes that were being investigated by the federal government, that evidence was carted off the night before. As we know from Kurt Sonnenfeld, who was a videographer for FEMA, the vault was empty. And Building 6 has a giant crater in the middle of it. It's an 8-story building, but it has a giant crater that goes down to the sub-basement level. And the New York Fire Department was trying to fight that fire and contain that fire before the towers even fell. So you see, when you talk about 9/11, you're talking about a crime within a crime within a crime. Very much like those Russian Matryoshka dolls, where you open up the doll, there's another doll inside, another doll. It's the same way. There's layers of deception, and there's crimes within crimes.
So you mentioned, obviously, this film, you know, that was Milchan produced. Ironically enough, he's won the Oscars the last 2 years in a row. And that actually happened after he admitted to being a notorious arms dealer who helped the Israelis to secure the nuclear bomb. Right? That confession occurred, and then all of a sudden he wins 2 Oscars. But his film dealt with a terror attack and a plane hitting a Pan Am building. But how does that, in a sense, you say it's a precursor or in a sense a foreshadowing of 9/11, but at what point do you think this attack was staged and, as you say, for covering up what crimes? Like what was the intention of the cover-up there? Well,
they had to have the cover-up because in such an atrocity there are 3 levels that have to be controlled. You have to control the investigation, you have to control the interpretation, and you have to control the litigation. So the first one is you have to control the access to the evidence. Because if proper investigative forensic examiners were able to access the steel of the World Trade Center, like the steel of the World Trade Center, this is a place where about 2,700 people died, more or less. But 93% of all the people who died in 9/11 died in those buildings. But that's the crime scene where all those people died. It was literally an American Holocaust because they were being cooked alive above those crash zones. The people who were trapped above the crash zones were being cooked alive, which is why so many jumped. But had that steel evidence been properly preserved and stored someplace and made available for a thorough investigation, then the true nature of the collapse would have been revealed early on. And that would have blown the whole thing out of the water because, as we now know, nanothermite was found in the dust. Basically, all that was left of the World Trade Center after 9/11 was dust and steel. Okay, the U.S. government did some little survey of the dust, and they found that all the dust contained tiny droplets of molten iron, basic little balls of iron. Well, where did that come from? That doesn't fit into the official version in any way, because there's no way that iron could be made molten in a crash scenario like they presented in their books. So, and then the interpretation, we were given a false interpretation of what happened on 9/11 by Ehud Barak, Israel's former defense minister and prime minister. He was in the London studios of the BBC World before the towers even fell. And he was giving this explanation. He said, the world will never be the same from today on. He said, we know who's behind this. It's basically, he says, it's Osama bin Laden. And we know where he is. And he said, now is the time for America to engage in an operational war on terrorism. And that little spiel that he gave on world television, BBC World, then became basically the takeaway from the whole thing. That's what everybody then believed from then on. That was the Israeli interpretation of 9/11.
It was there. I mean, it was what PNAC was calling for. The Project for a New American Century was calling for. Right. We need to basically we have to basically take onus of becoming the modern empire to secure the world, the world's policeman. We need a real Pearl Harbor.